Hi everyone, my name's Cameron and I'm a researcher with the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Today I'm joined by Dr. Vermonte at an event discussing the ASEAN Regional Forum, co-hosted by the AIIA and the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Vermonte is the Executive Director of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies based in Jakarta. So today we have a few questions for Dr. Vermonte about ASEAN, about the ASEAN Regional Forum and the relationship between Australia and Indonesia in that context. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So Dr. Vermonte, my first question is to do with think tank diplomacy. So you obviously work for a think tank, and today at the discussions we've heard about the role that think tanks play in relationships between countries and in ASEAN itself. What do you think is the role that these think tanks play?
Right, I think there are a number of contributions that think tank can give in terms of foreign policy making that we are talking about. Number one, think tank is somehow a research institute involving people from a non-official background, so to speak. So in a way, think tanks are more free to discuss sensitive issues related to sovereignty or related to national interest of each country. That is why then you have a free exchange of discussions and could come up with a very creative idea about how to, to solve immediate problems that countries are facing in a more academic way that then become more acceptable, because then it will be treated as an input, not directly penetrating the decision-making process of the government, and for that matter, maybe foreign policy establishment within the country. And number two, think tanks, or when they meet, of course, they then create personal relationships that could be very important in a situation where a country have differences or have conflicts with one another, but at least you know that somebodies are talking to each other, and that could ease the potential escalation of the conflicts. And number three, of course, think tanks provide the platform to give feedback to the policies of the government. So the first two that I was talking earlier, more on the input side of the think tank, but also think tank can provide a platform for the discussions of policies that have already been made by the governments, and then we can provide criticisms and then the inputs of how to refresh certain policies, or how to re-establish the policies for the government if the policies need to be readdressed and so on. So that's, I think, at least three contributions that think tank are usually making.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for those reflections.
Right.
Definitely a lot of think tanks represented here today, and they make such valuable contributions.
Right.
So my second question is a bit on a bit of a different track. Obviously, ASEAN as a group of 10 countries, they often are a bloc that agrees on a lot of issues. Do you think that Indonesia plays a leadership role in ASEAN? Right. And do you think that the expansion of ASEAN into forums like the ASEAN Regional Forum has resulted in people trying to challenge the leadership of Indonesia?
Well, first of all, I think we have to understand that ASEAN is an association. So it's a loose form of organization that, to some extent, it's non-binding. It is true that ASEAN has a charter that regulates the member countries, but ASEAN is not like a European Union that has certain regulations and for the member states and certain requirements to be the member of the European Union. And then secondly, ASEAN is not a sovereignty reducing body. It's even more sovereignty enhancing organizations that the member countries value the non-interference approach to problems in Southeast Asia. So in those two contexts, it's actually hard to say that ASEAN has a leader, but somehow many have suggested that Indonesia is a natural leader of ASEAN, given Indonesia is the largest country in Southeast Asia and so on. But to me, the term Indonesia as a natural leader of ASEAN is not related so much with power that sometimes assigned to a leadership role. It's more on the intellectual leadership, because Indonesia, together of course with some other ASEAN countries, provides some ideas for ASEAN to move forward, and then the other ASEAN countries accept and discuss it, and eventually it is adopted as an ASEAN projects. We, for example, in 2003 proposed this ASEAN Political Security Community, and not to mention in the beginning, I think in the establishment of ASEAN, and Indonesia I think was also important, because ASEAN was born out of conflicts in Southeast Asia, during which time Indonesia was the source of problems, so to speak, right? With all these policies against Malaysia and so on during the previous Sukarno government. So then Indonesia switched course, and then that enabled these 5 countries to form ASEAN. So the term leadership is, to me, more on the kind of intellectual leadership type of leaders that Indonesia has been playing the role.
Thank you so much.
All right.
That's a very interesting reflection. And so my final question today is, again, on a bit of a different topic, and it's more to do with the foreign policy of Indonesia.
Right.
Now, over time, we've seen that the foreign policy of Indonesia tends to be very much driven or changes according with the president of Indonesia, or the leader of Indonesia. What do you think the impact of Widodo has been on Indonesia's foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of style. Because the basic tenet of Indonesia's foreign policy does not really change, even since our independence. That is a free, active foreign policy, that basically telling that Indonesia would take no sides. Indonesia will act according to the assessment of the national interest. But of course, there are different styles of our leaders. And because you are asking about the presidents of Indonesia, some people said that Indonesia has been very inward-looking lately, and that is probably the right assessment. But it is due to a fact that Indonesia faces a huge domestic challenges in terms of development, in terms of democratic consolidations. We started the reform since 1998, and of course you will always have the possibility of the return of authoritarianism, so the government has to deliver in providing welfare to the people and so on and so forth. Now, President Jokowi has been stating since the very beginning of his presidency that his main priority will be the Indonesian economic development, and through infrastructure development and so on. Somehow, during the campaign in 2014 and up until today, he proposed to the Indonesian people the new identity of Indonesia as a maritime country. That is then tied up with this doctrine of Indonesia as a global maritime fulcrum. And that provides some guidance for Indonesia's foreign policy so far under his presidency in conducting relations with other countries. So regardless of the fact that the president is focusing on domestic political and economic development, Indonesia, I think in the past 4 years of his presidency, has been trying consistently enough to present the idea of Indonesia as a maritime country that then translate into some policies, including Indonesia's active involvement, for example, in the AIIA platform that is consisting of Australia and some other countries in the Indian Oceans. And in terms of infrastructure development as well, it is domestic political development, but it is related to this vision of Indonesia as a maritime country, that now the Indonesian government under the leadership of President Joko Widodo built new ports, enhance connectivities between islands in Indonesia and so on, that is consistent with this image later on of Indonesia as a maritime country. And then of course Indonesia remains committed to ASEAN, and then the president and the foreign minister will come here to Australia for the summit. And then in the other international fora, Indonesia also remains very active. Now Indonesia is campaigning for the a non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council. We don't know whether that will be successful, but at least it showed that there is this continued international commitment of Indonesia.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Vermonte. Very interesting conversations being had here today at this event, but also in this interview, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If these kind of conversations interest you and you want to read more about international affairs, you can definitely check out what the AIIA produces. So you can head to our website at www.internationalaffairs.org.au or check us out on Facebook. Thanks so much.